Gilles Deleuze was one of the major French philosophers of the 20th century. He was born in 1925 to fairly middle-class and conservative parents. As he was growing up, Paris was occupied by the Nazis. His brother was involved in the resistance and captured and died on his way to Auschwitz. This is one of the things that perhaps has coloured Deleuze's thought. He studied philosophy at the Sorbonne from 1944 to 1948. At that time, philosophy in France was largely dominated by three very fashionable figures, the three H's, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, who are the keystones of continental thought. Deleuze developed an interest in a fourth H outside that tradition, David Hume. And he wrote his first book on David Hume, which came out when he was 28. In Deleuze's early career, he rarely travelled from Paris, but it was normal for philosophers at that time to work in lycées, which are French secondary schools, and teach philosophy there while they're building up their reputation. He went on to write a major book on Nietzsche that came out in 1962, Nietzsche and Philosophy, which established his reputation as one of the leading interpreters of Friedrich Nietzsche in France at that time. The 60s were a very productive decade for him. He worked on a series of historical works on philosophers. In a way, he was a kind of historian of philosophy, very influenced by Hume and Nietzsche, whom I've already mentioned, but also Kant, Immanuel Kant, Henri Bergson, a distinctively French connection, and his great love, Baruch Benedict de Spinoza. And he wrote books on all these figures and other history of philosophy books later in his career on his friend Michel Foucault, just after Foucault's death, and also another one on Leibniz. The 1960s were also an important decade for Deleuze because that's when he met his collaborator Félix Guattari, and the two of them wrote their main works together, really. Félix Guattari was a psychoanalyst. He trained with Jacques Lacan for 7 years. He was something of an autodidact. He didn't have any formal academic qualifications. He dropped out of his first degree. But he was a member of the French anti-psychiatry movement and involved in running and living in a clinic called Laborde, where staff and patients work together to analyze the nature of society, the nature of mental illness, to work out how they should live. So there was no real hierarchy between staff and patients. It was a very experimental situation. And Guattari was also a political activist involved in various different radical cells, and eventually joined the Green Party and became involved in green politics. Deleuze and Guattari met in 1969, soon after the events of 1968, the big student uprising, in which in some ways their thought has been associated with. They wrote a radical book called Anti-Oedipus that became a bestseller in France. It sold about 70,000 copies, and was in some ways famous for its scandalous nature, the style of writing, its irreverence. In some ways, it's a combination of Freud and Marx, but it's also an attack on Freud and the institution of psychoanalysis. It's an attack on capitalism, and it's a rethinking of Marx and Freud in relation to Nietzsche. They continued to collaborate. There was a book on Kafka in 1974-5, and then their other main book, A Thousand Plateaus, came out in 1980. An extraordinary book, just full of newly invented concepts, and to read any section of it you have to understand the concepts that have been developed and introduced in any other section of it. So it doesn't have a linear structure beginning in a particular place or ending in a particular place. Deleuze also wrote a number of, I suppose we could call them critical works. There were works on Proust, Sacher-Masoch, 2 books on the cinema, the painter Francis Bacon, a number of essays on writers. And here he saw himself not simply doing a kind of literary or cultural criticism, so much as still doing philosophy, still working out and thinking through the concepts that would express the experimentations of the authors he was studying. The last book Deleuze wrote, again with Félix Guattari, was called What is Philosophy? And they look back on their lives and try to work out what it was they were doing. It came out in 1991, just before Guattari's death of a heart attack in 92. Deleuze himself died in 1995 at the age of 70. He'd had ill health since his 30s. He'd had a collapsed lung and breathing problems, and developed emphysema later in life. He'd been a heavy smoker, heavy drinker, and his latter years he was extremely ill. I wrote to him actually in his later years and got a reply, and I'd asked how his life was, and he described it as a little limited. He was chained up like a dog to cylinders of oxygen in order to help him breathe. Well, he died by falling out of the window of his apartment in Paris, which of course is most people take as a suicide, because he was extremely ill and dying anyway. But there is one rumor that was started by a cancer specialist, which is that it's very common for patients with emphysema to lean out of the window as far as they possibly can in a desperate attempt to get some fresh air into their lungs. And it may well have been that he just leant a bit too far, because apparently they often put these cancer wards on the ground floor of hospitals just so that this doesn't happen. So it's possibly, normally it's treated as a suicide, but it could possibly have been an accident. He was dying anyway. So that's his life from the mid-20th century. Deleuze is known primarily for his philosophy of immanence, which is perhaps a strange term. It's a term of theological provenance. I think St. Augustine was probably the first to develop it as a concept. So what does it mean? Well, for him, thought is like a kind of force field or an environment into which we enter and into which we participate. I sometimes like to illustrate this with the film Tron, which had a remake and a revival, so it might be better known now than it was, where a computer programmer enters into his computer program and becomes a character within it. Well, for philosophy of immanence, we are already within thought. It's not the case that thought is within us, but thought is a kind of environment that we enter into and are already within. So that's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it is that thought is a part of life. It's part of reality. If you think of what is real, well, thought is real. That's one of the things that people think from time to time, occasionally, not very much perhaps, but people do think. And that's part of reality. But there's an awful lot of reality that isn't thought, that isn't thinking, and the thinking person will be immersed entirely within the rest of reality. So this is the other side of immanence. It's a kind of immersion in reality. And this is a contrast to a lot of other images of thought. One other aspect of immanence is, I think, that Deleuze throughout his work is always concerned with the question, what does it mean to think? What does it mean to do philosophy? What is philosophy? What's it for? What's it do? What kind of a thing is it? And so for him, thought is concerned with thought itself. And this means that most of his reflections on life are mainly about the life of thought. A lot of readers don't make this kind of link and make this kind of connection and think that he is pontificating a whole set of opinions about the nature of life. Now, one thing that philosophy has been distinguished from very early, going back to Plato, is that it's not about opinion. So what is it about? For Deleuze, it's about concepts. It's about understanding the world through concepts. But concepts, in a sense, are in relation to other concepts. Concepts themselves could be laid out on what he calls a plane of immanence, an immanent plane. The concepts comprehend other concepts which relate to other concepts. And so the thinker is immersed in a world of concepts. Some concepts are helpful and useful in certain situations. They help us to solve certain problems. Other concepts are less helpful, really. Another way of understanding his philosophy of immanence is to approach it through Kant. In some ways, he's influenced by Kant, although he sees Kant as, in some way, a figure to oppose. Kant developed an immanent critique of reason. This means that he used reason to criticize reason itself. So he wasn't saying the reason why people get things wrong in philosophy is they have the wrong assumptions, they have the wrong opinions, they've developed this from somewhere else, or so other influences on their thought have made them produce errors. No, thought itself, reason itself, can produce its own illusions. And if we're not going to get lost in those illusions, we have to use reason to criticize reason. So that's an immanent critique of reason. And this was tremendously important for Kant, because it meant that when we look at reason and we look at the concepts that we use to make sense of the world, if we start thinking that those concepts represent something in reality, then perhaps we're taking a step too far. And famously for Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, the concepts of the world, the self, and God are presupposed by reason when we make sense of things, when we make sense of experience. But if you try and determine whether there's anything out there that this concept, the world, or the concept, the self, represents, you can quickly get caught up in a contradiction. And the contradiction would go like this. So suppose we think that everything in life happens for a reason. So the world, is the world here for a reason? Then yes. If so, then what's the reason for that reason? And you get to the question, does the world have a beginning in time? And you can say, well, this event has a beginning, and all events have a beginning, so we could keep going back and back and back forever. But you can also use the same reasoning, everything that happens as a reason, to say, well, there must be a reason for the whole thing, for the whole of the world, for the whole series of events. And that must be the unconditioned. That must be what is God. So Kant is arguing that these concepts of world and self and God, we like to imagine that they represent things in reality. But if we really truly believe that they do, then we're taking reason a step too far and we get lost in contradictions. So it's much easier to just say, look, they're within our reason, within the way we think. These concepts don't refer to anything outside, they're within the way we think about reality. Now, Deleuze generalizes that to all concepts. There are times when it's helpful to reason by using the concepts of world and self and God. But there are other times in history when our problems change. And perhaps these concepts aren't the most useful ones, and we need to think through other kinds of concepts. We need to invent or discover or get hold of other concepts that will help us to think in a new way. And in some ways Deleuze saw himself as a kind of metaphysician, but it's a strange kind of metaphysician, because he wants to know the world through concepts, but he's interested in the world that we now know from modern science and also from modern art. A lot of his thought is engaging with a whole range of different 20th century sciences and a whole range of different cultural and artistic figures from the 20th century. And these scientists who are discovering reality, and these artists are also thinking, but they're not thinking purely with words and purely with concepts. The philosopher's place is to think with concepts and to come up with a kind of concepts that will correspond to our kind of reality. So this is why he gets to his definition as philosophy as knowledge through pure concepts and the creation of concepts. So this is